Everybody, this is Perch. A lot of people talk in comics about manga versus North American comics, and how and there's fans of both. There's fans of manga who really despise what's going on in North American comics. There's people who dislike North American comics but can't pick up manga. I mean, lots of different opinions, of course. Uh, but one of the things that I guess should be said to be fair about the comparison, because I don't think you can compare manga and what goes on with, in particular, the Marvel and DC image. They're not apples to apples. It's not a completely fair comparison. Now, that doesn't mean it couldn't be, but it's not today. And what I mean by that is simply, if you take a look at manga, it's sold very differently now. It's sold in a off a chapter based kind of thing. There's a built in advantage to how a lot of manga is distributed, particularly with the shonen model and everything else, where it's easier to discover new manga because you're often handed stories, alongside stories you're already reading. So you're reading one story and you're given another story, and it helps it helps spread basically these new stories. It gives a natural advantage. That really isn't happening in the same way as it happens in North America, where you do have to buy in. You've got to make a financial commitment of usually around $4 in order to get a taste of some new comic. I mean, granted, U.S. comics do free samplers. There's free comic book day. There's all that kind of stuff. But I mean, it's really poor in a lot of sense of a lot of the samples or stories that are kind of they're artificial. It's an interesting trap around the idea of the free comic, or hey, we're going to give this audience a sample of what this book is like, but it reads like a sample. It doesn't read like part of the story. It's a recap, or it's a summarization of what's going on, as opposed to the actual comic. And I think there's been a lot of proof in the past that if you're going to hand somebody a sampler comic that has a kind of a recap of the story thus far, it's not indicative of the actual comic the person's going to read. It's giving you a flavor of it, but it's actually less likely to hook people for the long term than if they actually get the start of a storyline, or they get some comic that leads into more. It's a kind of an interesting marketing trap, because I think when people think about providing some piece of content out there to kind of entice fans in, they often create something special for that purpose, and it winds up not being quite like the comic people are going to get. But that's one aspect of it. The other aspect to manga, though, and I think this is probably the more significant one, is that typically manga has the same creator, the same writer, same artist, same, in a lot of cases it's the same person, but the same uh, individual who has a story in mind, and they are telling this story with a lot of ownership. They're telling the story they want to tell. In this sense, maybe it's a little bit more like Image, but when they're done with that story, the manga ends. There's far less of a desire to kind of just keep things going because the title is selling well. There's been plenty of very popular manga titles that have ended, where the creator is done. They tell their story and they're over. They don't have this weakness of basically having to keep the story going in perpetuity. I mean, Batman. Does Batman ever end? If you're an incredible writer and you have thought up the perfect Batman story that takes you from beginning to end, um, you're not going to be writing Batman, because Batman can't end. It's going to just go on forever. And you have seen like the Black Labels and the things like that put out stories, but it, it it's you have to be fair in that manga has an advantage, in that typically the people who are making those stories, they have a finite story they're telling. They have a clear vision that they can go execute on. They're not having to inherit somebody else's vision. They're not having to just kind of be somebody who takes something from point A to point B. Now, keep in mind, there have been plenty, obviously you've listened to this channel, there's been plenty of amazing Western North American comics that have come in, tell a good story, and leave, and the character can keep going. It's not like if you can't tell the full story from beginning to end, you can't tell a good story. Lots of people have told a good story, but it is easier if in it is easier if you have full control from the beginning, that you don't have to worry about anything anyone else has done, that when you're over, that you can write to an ending. These are all advantages manga has. And so it's a little bit easier, I think, for them to tell the story they really want to tell, to be able to hook the audience, to be able to build in kind of the various rises and falls of a property. It's just it's an advantage that they have. I don't know. I think overall, manga is as we've talked about before. I mean, the markets are just very, very different in a lot of cases, and so I see people will say things like, "Well, North American comics can learn a lot from manga." They absolutely can. I think there are very big things to learn. I think that there's important lessons about how mangas manage to keep and retain their audience and market to them and sell them a story. And I think North American comic companies should be looking at the manga model. In particular, how manga tackled digital has been far more successful than what's happened here in North America. But there are also just fundamental differences to the projects themselves. And so if we're being truly fair about it, then we have to take those into account. It's not like My Hero Academia and the Avengers or Spider-Man or Superman are very, very different from inception to end. And there's a lot more going on to it. Nobody loves to hear this, I know, but one of the factors of North American comics, particularly those that are owned by AT&T and Disney, and that is the way you should look at them. It is a bigger play. The comic is just one piece of the overall puzzle, and in many cases, it's a small piece. The overall puzzle includes a lot of licensing, includes movies, includes all these other pieces that mean that you don't have the same kind of freedom and flexibility that, say, a creator who is making their manga story has, where there may be some movies, there may be some other things, but the heart of the idea is owned by an individual who has full control to do whatever they want with it. And don't get me wrong, it's been said, and there's been articles written around a number of manga properties where people have felt like the creators left a lot of money on the table, left a lot of value untapped that really should have been captured. That they absolutely should have done more with these properties, and they didn't because the creator ended the title too early. That's been said about a number of things. But that's so you can definitely make the argument that some manga failed to fully realize its potential, failed to capture the kind of money that it could have gotten if it was handled more like a North American property. But at the same time, because they're freed up from those requirements, it makes them far less likely to fall into the kind of traps that we see in North American comics all the time. I mean, one of the things that I think people feel, but they don't necessarily recognize what they're feeling, is that I've heard this described that a lot of comics in the U.S., particularly for Marvel and DC, feel aimless, that they don't feel like they have a gravity, that they're just kind of killing time. Well, the reality is they kind of are. These comics, there's nobody's going to cancel Batman. Nobody's going to come in and cancel Spider-Man. So they're going to put writers on them, and the writer is going to try and trick you into thinking that there's some real stakes, that there's danger, that if you don't read it, you're going to miss out on something huge. That's kind of the trick. But it doesn't change the fact that the comic is going to continue. It's one of the jokes about death in comics. You're going to kill Superman, but he's going to come back. He's going to come back because they've got to sell T-shirts and movies and toys and everything else. A Spider-Man can be put in lots of jeopardy, but Peter Parker is still going to be Spider-Man. The idea that these major changes are going to take place are minimal. They're minimal by design. They kind of have to be. And the trick of the big publisher is to present the illusion that this could be it, this could be the end, this could be the story that if you miss it, it will be gone, and we need to create that level, that feeling of urgency and anxiety. But at the end of the day, title's probably going to keep going one way or another, and that's just that's the nature of the business. Manga is the opposite; it can end, and that's just kind of how it sits. But I think there's advantages to both. I mean, a lot of people, I think, who criticize North American comics and say they wish things were more like manga, it sounds good, But that means that you as a person have to be willing to accept the fact that sometimes these stories are going to come to a conclusion, including characters you really, really love. Comic fans in North America, to be fair, tend to not handle that very well. We see kind of this outrage and chaos when characters die. I was not a fan of the storyline, but when they ended Peter and Mary Jane's marriage, that was an ending. People didn't like that. In manga, stuff ends and then it's over, and that's just what you have to get used to. I think I personally think that's better. I always think that stories are better and more precise and tend to tell a better story when they're writing to an end, when it's not just kind of keep the wheels spinning forever and present the illusion of change. I like conclusions to things. It's better for me. But I've sold many, many thousands of comics to thousands of people, and the majority of them do not really want that end. They would like things to go on forever. That's normal. That's what North American comics largely serve. What about you? Do you like comics that end? Do you like comics that go on forever? Are you one of those people who wishes that North American comics, U.S. comics, were more like manga? Are you sure? And I'm sure, by the way, I gave a couple of examples. There's other parts of manga, like at times there's a quality level, at times there's a price point advantage. There's a lot of other aspects to this that I absolutely wish North American comics would inherit. The way that they promote, the way that they're priced, the way that they're marketed and branded in a lot of cases. I think there's absolutely things, as we've talked about before, that North American comics can pick up and use from manga, and they should in their own best interest. But there's some other factors as well. So what do you think about all this? Let me know in the comments below. Like and subscribe, and thanks for listening.